Well, Russia has also requested another UN Security Council meeting to discuss Kiev's ongoing persecution of the political opposition and the Orthodox Church in Ukraine. Well, we can discuss all of this now with our guest, Dmitry Polyansky, Russia's first deputy permanent representative to the UN. Many thanks for joining us on the programme. We understand how busy you are, so we really appreciate your time today. Now, it's been almost 11 months since Russia launched its special operation in Ukraine. How has the attitude towards the conflict in Ukraine developed in international diplomatic circles recently? Has it changed, or has it mostly remained the same, in your opinion?
Hello. In my opinion, I think it has changed a lot, because now we feel that there is a lot of fatigue about Ukrainian topic. Most of the countries, they don't understand what's the best way to proceed. There are more and more requests for peaceful efforts, for ending this peacefully. But actually, there is a different sense that different sides are including into this formula. So, as you rightly said, I was listening to the previous speaker, that the Ukrainian formula is very shallow. It's, as we pointed out yesterday during the Security Council meeting, it implies the capitulation of Russia and the defeat of Russia. That's peace in Ukrainian way. And of course, it ignores the root causes of the conflict that Ambassador Nebenzia also highlighted yesterday in Security Council. And this is an important part of the equation that can't be ignored when we speak about possible diplomatic ways to solve the conflict. And more countries now understand this. Of course, there is a group of our former Western partners, as we call them now, and they are very stubborn. They understand that they have to proceed and repeat all these mantras about Russia's fault, Russia's aggression, Russia's occupation, etc. But there are more and more countries that understand that this is a multidimensional crisis that dates back at least 8 years or 9 years ago, and this whole thing should be tackled in entirety.
And you recently announced that Russia has arranged 2 UN Security Council meetings regarding Ukraine for next week, but you said you wanted to keep the specifics of them secret from the other delegations for now. Are there any more details about those meetings you could share with us at the moment?
Yeah, at the moment when I was writing this in my Telegram channel, there was indeed necessity for some kind of secrecy, but yesterday Ambassador Nebenzia gave the details that we wanted to hold a meeting on Tuesday afternoon, New York time. It will be around 11 p.m. Moscow time, about the trends, the very worrying trends in Ukraine that are, in our mind, threatening international peace and security. And this is about the dictatorship of Zelensky being reinforced, attacks on the opposition, prosecution and persecution of those who think in another way, of dissidents, and also, of course, the attacks against Russian Orthodox Church in Ukraine, which is really very, very worrying situation, and potentially it can lead to big problems. So we want to discuss it with our Security Council colleagues, and we want to present to them the information that they lack to understand the seriousness of this matter.
Indeed.
And also you mentioned the second meeting. Sorry to jump in. It's the ARIA formula meeting. It's an informal meeting of Security Council, but still it's a meeting of Security Council. We plan it next Friday in the morning, and it will be an opportunity for us to bring in people from Donbass, residents of Donbass, as well as international journalists who visited Donbass and saw with their own eyes what was going on there for 8 years, and with specific accent on recent Ukrainian strikes that were very severe, the strikes in December last year.
All aimed at, I suppose, highlighting and opening people's eyes to the realities on the ground. We know that Kiev is taking further steps to persecute the Ukrainian Orthodox Church as well as political opposition parties, and yet the government is still being portrayed as a bastion of freedom by most Western media and politicians. Why do you think they're turning a blind eye to these undemocratic moves by Kiev?
Well, we can remember one U.S. president's words about dictator Samosa, that maybe he is a son of a bitch, but he is our son of a bitch. So Zelensky is, of course, the same personage of this kind, and they have to really ignore what he is doing. And they have given a long time ago the blank check to Ukrainian regime, to Kiev regime, for any crimes that they are doing, and they are ready to close their eyes as long as Ukraine is performing as a tool for them to undermine Russia or even to cancel Russia. But of course, these are futile attempts, and more people, including here in the UN, are coming to realize this.
There is a mainstream opinion in the West that Ukraine is actually fighting for global democracy and that the conflict is part of a global struggle between democracies and authoritarian regimes. What are your thoughts on this portrayal?
I think that's pathetic, frankly, and we know this theory a long time ago, these messianic, I would say, thoughts in the US and the Western allies that they are bringing freedom and democracy, and that the US is kind of world policeman who is interfering into different kinds of conflicts. But nobody is welcoming US, and nobody has given any mandate to the US for this, as well for the Western countries. So Ukraine is now being portrayed as this kind of messenger of peace and freedom, on the contrast with autocratic Russia, I would say. This is a very sexy picture that they want to promote in the West, here in the US in particular. But I think that there are more and more failures in promoting this picture. And largely because of the fact that more and more people start to realize what kind of dictator Zelensky is indeed, and what kind of processes are happening in Ukraine. And these are not processes that started after the beginning of our special military operation. These are the processes that were deep-rooted in the policies of Ukrainian regime for many years, at least for 8 years. So this is a consequence of what the West has been really promoting in Ukraine from the outset.
Speaking on Friday, Russia's UN ambassador said that the situation in Ukraine could have gone very differently if only Kiev had complied with the Minsk agreements. So what exactly prevented Ukraine from doing that? As
we know now, exactly the fact that the Western countries and the guarantors of the Minsk agreements, France and Germany, they were not intending to seek the implementation of Minsk agreements from Ukraine from the outset. And they said it bluntly. Chancellor Merkel and President Hollande acknowledged that this was the reality. This is, of course, a very eye-opening and a trust-breaking situation. Of course, in such circumstances, we understand that all these statements from President Poroshenko and later President Zelensky were not sudden. They were premeditated, and they reflected the understanding that they had with the Western countries that, in fact, Ukraine had to imitate the process. It didn't have to seriously engage in the implementation of Minsk agreements, as was foreseen by UN Security Council Resolution 2202. So they were breaching this resolution knowingly. They were kind of paying lip service to all these things, and they were trying to convince the international community that it is Russia who is not implementing Minsk agreements, which is ridiculous because Russia is not part of these agreements. So we had a good chance. We really think that if Minsk agreements were implemented, all these things could have been avoided, that we are now in. But we have what we have, and we are what we are. And of course, the situation has gone much further than 1 year ago.
Yeah. In the past few months, we've actually seen some Western politicians openly admit the Minsk process was merely a ploy to buy time to arm and prepare Ukraine for a conflict with Russia. So how is Moscow supposed to take any future international peace efforts seriously when Kiev and its Western backers have such a poor record of sticking to their pledges?
I think the way you put it, of course, this undermines very seriously the trust. We have virtually no trust in the West right now. You should add to this picture also the futile promises made by the West that NATO will not expand eastwards, that were given to us in the 90s, to Soviet leadership, to Russian leadership. We all understand now that this was also a ploy. So a combination of this makes of the West, I think, the least trustworthy person on the planet. So we, of course, have to take it into consideration, and we have to draw lessons from what was before. So that's the only answer I can give to this question.
In one of your previous interviews, you said the latest revelations by Angela Merkel and Francois Hollande created a lack of trust, which is the biggest hurdle in the relationship between Moscow and the West. Now, trust is certainly something that's all too easy to lose, but incredibly hard to build back up. So what do you think can possibly change that situation? How can we mend these ties?
Well, of course, we need to see that the West has really understood the mistakes of its policies. We need to see the real change of attitude towards support of Ukrainian regime, because what they are doing there is absolutely giving a blank check to all the crimes against humanity, against the population of Ukraine, against Russian-speaking population, all these kinds of discrimination against Russian-speaking population, and now the Russian Orthodox Church as well. We also need to understand that there is a genuine change of attitude towards negotiations with Russia that we proposed, I think, 1 year ago, or even a little bit more than 1 year ago, on the principles of security in Europe. And this should be a very serious and deep process without any superficial attempts to accuse Russia of all the evils and to present Russia as really somebody who is a troublemaker for the international community. If there is a change, I think there are chances that we will be negotiating in good faith again, and I think this will be a very good scenario for the whole world. But frankly, we are very far from this right now.
Ambassador Nebenzia also stressed that Russia is seeking a diplomatic solution to the conflict. So what's your personal assessment of the likelihood of that scenario at this stage?
Well, as I said in the previous question, I think we're very far from this. We don't lose hope. We see that a lot of people in the West, including Western diplomats, are really thinking very seriously about drawing lessons from the past. But there are no practical steps in this direction, and all that we hear at political level is this belligerent rhetoric and warmongering. So I don't think that we have any reasons to be very optimistic at this stage.
Ukraine has demanded the exclusion of Russia from the UN Security Council amid the ongoing crisis. Why have Russia's actions been the focus of such attention and not the actions of other member states over the years, like the US, for example, during all of its military interventions around the world, which were never approved by the UN?
I don't think we compare ourselves with the US, with somebody else. We are Russians. We come from Russia, and Russia is a concrete particular state. And there is no big need in such a comparison that they did this and we are doing this, and that's why we are equal. We think that any violations of international law should be condemned, and there should be consequences for this. And that was in our letter. When we started this special military operation, we explained the reasons why we had to do so. So all these Ukrainians' initiatives, I think they are so ridiculous that they are being ignored, and I haven't had a word about this, frankly, in the Security Council. Well, legally, it's laughable, and I think that's really a political crusade of several Ukrainian diplomats, that this personal crusade and vendetta, and they are trying to pursue this line of action, but everybody is just wondering how ridiculous it is.
Kiev says it wants to hold a peace summit, but without Russia. How can one part of the conflict possibly be excluded from peace talks?
Well, I think these efforts are maybe being deployed in the same line as previously there were summits on democracy, on whatever, coalition of the willing. So it's a fragmentation of international community. It's totally contrary what multilateralism is. And all these discussions about the summit are, of course, very propagandist. And Kiev wants to show that he enjoys large or overwhelming support on the international arena, which is not the case, of course, especially today. As I told you, a lot of people are really starting to think about the root causes of this problem, and they now have different optics to what Kiev does. So, of course, this pushes Ukrainian leadership to invent different types of propagandist formulas or shallow initiatives like this summit. We don't understand the details. Nobody understands the details. because in order to conduct a summit in the UN, you need to have well, the decision of the General Assembly. It has certain budget implications which should be decided in General Assembly. If you want to hold a meeting on the sidelines of the UN or somewhere else and call it a summit or label it a summit, well, you're not forbidden to do so, but you shouldn't really engage in wishful thinking and call it a summit. This is absolutely different exercise.
Well, the Ukrainian Foreign Ministry has said that Russia will only be invited to the peace summit if it faces a war crimes tribunal first. Moscow has strongly rejected this proposal. How do you see the situation developing from here?
Well, again, there were these very obscure and opaque Ukrainian statements about the fact that they want to hold a summit. As far as we understand, this boils down to the the regular meeting of emergency session on Ukraine, which was triggered last year. A meeting of the Security Council, but they happen frequently, once or twice every month. So the combination of these two doesn't give you a result of a summit. But again, I don't want to really speculate on this because we don't know the detail. Nobody knows the details here in the UN. Well, Ukrainians are very inventive people. Let's see what kind of thing they will think of this time.
I understand that you've said before that imagining a peace summit without Ukraine is very easy. What exactly did you mean by that?
Well, I mean that if Ukraine continues in the same vein, if Ukrainian leadership doesn't think about its own people, if it acts as a proxy of NATO, and as Ambassador Nebenza said it yesterday in Security Council, as a private military company sponsored by the West, the consequences can be very dire for the Ukraine as a state. As we said repeatedly, there is never an aim of our special military operation to destroy Ukraine, to perform Russification of Ukraine. We just want to get rid of the threats from Ukraine that is endangering Russia. We want to stop the shellings of Donbas that were continuing for 8 years. And that's it. But if it continues like this, of course, the stakes are very high and nobody knows how it will end for Ukraine at the end. I don't want to get into the detail, but I think you understand what kind of scenarios this can imply for Kiev.
When it comes to a special tribunal for Russia, as suggested by Ukraine, what's your understanding and assessment of the Western vision of this potential process?
Well, I haven't heard anything practical in this regard, and I understand why, because any initiatives like this in the General Assembly would be absolutely legally void, because General Assembly doesn't have this kind of authority to establish this kind of thing. This is a popular idea floating in the West. It is being exploited for populist and political reasons, but I don't see any practical substance in it other than would make serious legal people laugh and shrug their shoulders. But otherwise, I think this is still very vague and more of political nature than of legal.
And what do you make of the UN Secretary General's statements regarding his readiness to take personal action to help resolve the conflict?
He always mentioned that he is ready, provided both parties ask him for this. He made a good job in the grain deal and in the Black Sea initiative that, on the one hand, promoted export of Ukrainian grain, on the other hand, export of fertilizers and food products from Russia. There are big reserves in terms of the Russian part of the deal, but still we see that Secretary General is quite active and deploying a lot of efforts. So I think he is having in mind something of this sort. But again, it takes two to tango if we understand the weird Ukrainian logic. So peace is only capitulation of Russia. And of course, this is not something that could be a basis for any kind of negotiation. As we said yesterday in Security Council, there was a moment in March when Ukraine, unfortunately, withdrew its own proposal on the peace deal, which we were ready to discuss, because Ukraine was convinced by several Western countries that it is capable of defeating Russia with the help of Western weapons. I think that was a very fatal mistake, and this was a turning point in the whole thing. Now, Ukrainians do not overpass or surpass the schemes, each of which implies that Russia will be defeated and Russia will be condemned and so on and so forth. This is, of course, a non-starter for any negotiations, and I don't see any reasons, any real circumstances for negotiations right now, given the situation that I described.
Dmitry Polyansky, Russia's first deputy permanent representative to the UN. Many thanks for your time. I really appreciate your time today. Thank you.
Thank you very much.